feel like it's a little strange, I guess, that I keep talking about trans women's participation in sport, despite the fact that I am not a trans woman. But hey, I'm still non binary trans, and I want to talk about their issues. Like, I would never try to play on a women's team. I would also never try to play on a men's team. I might join a co ed team. I don't really do sports. But anyway, there's been a long conversation that's been quite frustrating about, ooh, trans women have this crazy advantage, and ooh, they are joining women's sports deliberately in order to win. It's an unfair, unsportsmanlike advantage. Like, ooh, they have greater bone density and bigger hearts, and they're taller, blah, blah, blah. Like, there's a million different things that are asserted without really substantial evidence. Now, I have seen one study that concluded that testosterone did not make as big of a competitive difference as, for example, having like worse coaches and sports equipment and funding at a younger age. So like women's sports are underfunded and undervalued for like their entire lives, and that creates a lifetime difference in performance versus the boys getting like good coaches and good equipment. But we're actually seeing evidence now, and I have suspected this for a while, but we are looking at a study or an article about a study that is indicating that transgender women might actually have a disadvantage compared to cisgender women. So trans women versus non-trans women. And I've suspected this for a while because, you know, trans women are allowed to perform at the Olympics, but trans women don't win at the Olympics pretty much at all. I don't think trans women even place. They do participate, not a lot of them, but they do participate, but they don't win. So it's interesting, and I'm glad to see that there's some evidence actually on this now. If you're enjoying this video, hit the like button, maybe subscribe, hit all notifications if you want. Feel free to check out the links in the description. You might find some merch you like, or you can hit up the Patreon to support the content and find free stuff. Of course, this is not necessarily going to be persuasive to anybody who is already against trans people in sports, but like, hey, you keep saying that trans women have an advantage? Well, hey, guess what? Actually, research funded by the International Olympic Committee has found that in several key metrics, they're at a disadvantage compared to cisgender women. So we're looking at physically active transgender women, and they performed worse in certain tests. Okay, you know, they keep saying, oh, but your heart is bigger and the muscles are stronger because you're trans or whatever. But actually, in certain cardiovascular tests, trans women do worse. They also have less lower body strength than cisgender females. They found that, contrary to previous claims, transgender women's bone density was equivalent to cisgender females. Bone density is linked to muscle strength. So hey, did you know that trans women, when they join these sports teams, are often required to have a lower blood level of testosterone than the average cis woman? Most cis women are not then having their blood tested and being forced to take drugs to reduce their testosterone. That does happen to certain intersex women, usually black women. But on the whole, it's not like every cis woman who participates is having their testosterone regulated, but every trans woman who participates has her testosterone regulated, and she is supposed to have less T than most cis women. And if testosterone is supposed to be a big defining factor, then any advantage that trans women would have had is going to be completely knocked out. You know, if cis women have higher T in the sporting world, if you're going to keep claiming that testosterone is this big advantage, then, well, trans women basically don't, like if you've had an orchidectomy, you don't produce your own testosterone. So you might have zero blood testosterone unless you start supplementing it. So like, yeah, no wonder trans women rarely win these participations, these sports. Yeah, people do be acting like bones are just unchangeable rocks. Like, nope, they change with your lifespan. They change over time. If you have low T and a lowish dose of estrogen, your bone density is going to get screwed. You're going to develop osteoarthritis. This research paper has been published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. It's the first research relating to the issue that the IOC has funded and is the first scientific study of, quote, athletes who have undergone gender-affirming hormone therapy. Yeah, okay, so you know how for years people have been telling me, you know, there's all this data showing that, you know, trans women outperform cisgender women. And it immediately, the only like Olympic level evidence on this is showing that transgender women are at a disadvantage. Yeah, and of course, cisgender women are capable of outperforming cisgender men as well, because humans are barely sexually dimorphic, but whatever. The authors of this study, which included a member of the IOC's Medical and Scientific Commission, said that these results showed that sporting federations should caution against banning transgender women from the female category without further research into their individual sports. So we may conclude that in basketball or something, that there should be a gender difference, or maybe it should just be discriminated by height, whatever. So, but in general, unless there is compelling evidence in some individual sport that there is some unfair advantage, and like the thing is that it has to be I think it has to be an unfair advantage. It has to be an unsportsmanlike unfair advantage. If you're just like, okay, well, some women are too tall. Okay, well, then create height differences. Oh, we don't like how dense these women's bones are. Well, first of all, this evidence shows that their bones are not that dense. But also, if you had a bone density problem, just measure everybody's bone density and then discriminate the teams based on that. It's just about wanting to discriminate trans women out of sports. It's about wanting to deny them recognition for being female. Yeah, it's noteworthy that this article is published in the Telegraph, because they do tend to publish anti-trans stuff. While longitudinal transitioning studies of transgender athletes are urgently needed, these results should caution against precautionary bans and sport eligibility exclusions that are not based on sport-specific or sport-relevant research. They've also added that the research could be used to inform policymaking at a time when several sports have excluded trans women from the female category, including athletics, swimming, and cycling, but on its own could not provide the basis for decisions. So they're just hedging their bets a little bit. They're just saying, hey, we understand that this one report might not be a convincing, overwhelming evidence to say, we should definitely always let trans women into the female category, but rather that this should stand as a caution going, hey, some of these beliefs about trans women's alleged excellence compared to cisgender women is not substantiated, not well substantiated, and sometimes directly counteracted. And of course, this is a relatively small sample size of 69 volunteers. Cohort comprised 19 transgender women, 20 cisgender women, 19 cisgender men, and 11 transgender men. Okay, so this compared metrics on all 4 of these groups of people. In order to qualify for the study, these people had to be taking part in a competitive sport or physical training at least 3 times a week. The trans volunteers needed to have undergone hormonal therapy for at least 1 year. None of these subjects were competing in national or international sport. Okay, so this was commissioned by the Olympics, but we're not studying people who are actually doing national or international sport. I'm curious if those differences are maintained at the highest levels of competition, but, it remains to be seen. It's good that there's research being done on this, because we know the facts. We know that trans women do not have an advantage. Even if you study these things, and maybe even if it turns out that transgender women have a slightly higher performance in some cardiovascular test, that does not translate to an unfair advantage. Like that, it does not necessarily mean that just because certain types of people, it's like if you took a study and looked at, the difference of performance with Black people versus white people. Generally, there are some differences, but they're not big enough differences that we say, okay, well, we want white people to be able to actually win at track sometimes. Therefore, the Black people need to be in their own area because Black people are just too physically good at running. And so they keep winning all the running. I mean, literally, if you look at some of the highest levels of performance in sport, sometimes there are a lot of Black individuals. And you could make an argument, it's a disingenuous argument, it's a bad argument. But if you're going to make the argument about trans people having some kind of fundamental unfair advantage and therefore needing to be segregated out, okay, but where are we drawing that line? We could draw that line anywhere. I got annoyed at Michael Phelps coming out against trans women in sports because of an unfair advantage. Yeah, you mean that freak with the extra wide arms had anything to say about an unfair advantage? Yeah, true, Dizzy. There's a difference between like estrogens are actually important to physical performance, because people with more estrogens than androgens tend to have less overall strength, but they have quicker recovery time for their muscles, which means that women's endurance is better than men's on average. So, and while women might be able to lift less in a plateau of strength, but they can lift that maximum for many more repetitions and sets than a man could. It's like stamina versus outright strength. Women win in marathons more because they are better on some biological level. Minute difference, slightly better able to like carry on the stamina for a long time. Yeah, the extra wide arms and mutation to not produce lactic acid. I didn't know about the second part of that. So these individuals were assessed across 3 categories, including cardiorespiratory fitness and strength and body competition. Researchers found that trans women performed worse than cis women in the counter movement jump that tests lower body strength. This involves jumping vertically with hands on the hips. Transgender women's average jump was shorter than cis women's. Okay, cool. Cis women performed worse in an important test of lung function, which compares the subject's forced expiratory volume with their forced vital capacity. Trans women had a lower FEV1, which is this. So transgender women had a lower ratio of the breathing lung function. Because that's another thing that they say is like, oh, trans women are statistically taller or bigger and therefore they have bigger lungs. But this is showing that there's a significant difference which could adversely affect trans women's athletic performance with this breathing stuff. No meaningful difference between the 2 groups' hemoglobin profiles. That's another thing. People always say, oh, there's more hemoglobin in trans women, blah, blah, blah. Like, no. Bone density, both of these are related to athletic performance, although previous studies of sedentary subjects found that transgender women performed better in both. Yeah, that's different when you're looking at athletes, though. Sedentary subjects are not representative of what is going on with athletes. Results further showed that trans women had a significantly higher percentage of fat mass, lower fat-free mass, and weaker hand grip strength than cisgender men. Okay, so comparing them to cisgender men, they perform worse, I guess. So yeah, these discrepancies should prevent anyone viewing trans women and men as synonymous when addressing the issue of gender inclusion. Quote, the profound message from this research needing to be heard loud and clear by all international federations in their assessment of the limited literature when determining their transgender policy is the requirement to treat trans women as very different to cis men. Hold on, who is this? Yeah, this is the guy who led the research. Okay, cool. So apparently trans women do have slight height and weight advantages, but again, if you have height and weight advantage and you find that that's a problem, just create height and weight classes. Wow, not hard. It's also interesting that a lot of the time, yeah, there's a 2 years of hormones requirement as a participation standard, but even at 1 year, we're showing that, we're balancing out, we're getting even. Part of the path of acceptance for Black people in the West was the fact that they can do sports and being visible to the general public and developing goodwill as people you can admire. And of course, they want to deny that to trans people. They don't want trans people to be in positions that are admirable. So the fact that transgender women performed worse in several metrics shows that further research is needed before sporting federations decide whether to ban them from the female category. So many different groups are denying trans women entry, and a lot of it's not even physical advantage related. Like, oh, chess? Okay, so you're for real? Chess is you're gonna require me to like have a different league for chess? Okay. Throwing darts? Dancing? Like, okay. It's not about there being an unfair advantage. It's about wanting to discriminate trans people out of the population. So I just thought that that was an interesting study. I think it's interesting to look at. And, if people keep complaining to me about needing data, like they don't seem to feel like they need data to justify banning trans women from things. They seem like pretty thoroughly convinced that their gut feeling about trans women being the same as men and like men being overwhelmingly stronger than women, they kind of just believe that their feelings about that are facts. So it's kind of nice to be able to produce facts, even though they're the ones who are asserting something. They're the ones making an assertion, and they seem to have absolutely no qualms with making assertions without evidence. Like, I should be able to just dismiss their claim without evidence as well, except that I do have evidence, and that evidence is that trans women are not overwhelmingly winning at these sports, and we've seen studies that show that funding makes a much bigger difference to performance, and now we have another study showing that, hey, even on all these individual things, okay, sure, they do have a height and weight advantage on average. Higher weight, higher height. Okay, cool. Just create height and weight classes. They don't have more hemoglobin. They don't have denser bones. They don't have better lung function. Like, what else is there? I always got the impression the chess community is misogynistic, not gonna lie. I mean, that's one of the justifications that gets used now. That the main chess leagues are co-ed, but women prefer not to perform in them because of the discrimination and like the particular, misogyny. Like, okay, cool. I guess, like, personally, I would say that you need to just start disqualifying misogynistic players for being unsportsmanlike so that we don't have a necessity for there being a separate female league. But also, why do you think trans women want to be in the female league? If the trans women are also allowed to compete in the main league, maybe it's because they're also trying to avoid the misogyny of the co-ed league. What? But no, trans women are people who are not deserving of protection if they are even considered people by these folks. So we'll see. Truly, if this situation were about facts, logic, and reason, we would not even be having this conversation. Like, yeah. The type of guy who is so obsessive that he's brilliant at chess tends to also be unwilling to question his misogyny. That's fine. He doesn't need to be willing to question his misogyny, but he needs to be permanently disqualified for unsportsmanlike behavior. Like, I don't know why this is so difficult. Literally, why is there a women's league if the primary league is co-ed? If the reason is misogynistic chess players, kick them out. It's not hard. The sports thing is also a magnet for transphobes because they want to pretend it's the only problem trans women face. Like, we have everything else. We just want to bully our way into women's sports. Yeah. It's such a superficial thing. Like, if you're participating in sports, you already kind of are at a level of privilege. You can afford to eat well enough to be able to perform in the sports. You can afford to take time off work to train. Or maybe you can afford the gym to train in. It's such a distraction from the fact that the overwhelming majority of trans women do not get access to healthcare. The rate of sexual assault committed against trans women is higher per capita than the rate of sexual assault committed against cisgender women. There's homelessness, there's all kinds of whatever. Like, to make it about sports as though, like, this is the only contentious issue that trans people are facing is, it's just wild. And it continues this view that being trans is a privileged thing, that you do it in order to gain advantage, or you do it in order to get away from misogyny or something. Yeah, for sure you see people saying, I don't have a problem with trans people, but sports. Like, I don't have a problem with them, but I do want to discriminate against them in one of the, like, globally understood desirable positions. Like, the Olympics is about trying to bring together a bunch of different people from a bunch of different places and celebrate, like, the competition, like, celebrate the togetherness that you can bring through the competition of sports. And yeah, they want to bar trans people from that. Also, none of the people mad about trans people in sports even watch women's sports in the first place. Yeah, if they banned globally all trans women from participating in sports, they would just go back to ridiculing women's sports and not watching the WNBA. They don't care about it. Yeah, lots of people showing up just to boo Leah Thomas. They care so much about women's sports. Thank you, my patrons, especially Tiago Nascimento, Mersh Rolvag, Amanda B., Michelle Frateroli, Wellington Marcus, Michelle Winter, Danielle McDonald, Suzanne Maynard, DZXN, Spooky Heather Sylvia, Ella V. Nobody, Pasnell Infinity, Jamie Jam, Sojo, Nova, Elizabeth Bartell, Athiet, Kevin Young, Desi Quiche, Celeste, Liam Hodgson, and Mr. Atheist.